Welcome to the Social Business Engine podcast, where today's thought leaders discuss how they're using the latest social media strategies and technologies in marketing, sales, customer service, and HR. Get ready to be inspired as our guests contribute to your digital transformation through their stories, knowledge, and insights into what works in today's digitally connected world. And now, here's Bernie Borges, your host of the Social Business Engine podcast.
Hey there, welcome to episode 184. I'm Bernie Borges, CMO of Vengreso, and your host of the Social Business Engine podcast. Hey, as always, thanks for listening. On this episode, you are going to meet Glenn Donovan. Glenn Donovan is the Director of Clients at GaggleAMP. So on this episode, Glenn and I have a conversation about a topic that we both have a passion for because, well, actually, we have a passion for this topic for a lot of reasons. Now, I don't want to steal Glenn's thunder, so let's just say that Glenn and I have been around long enough to know that the modern buyer today needs a modern seller. Otherwise, there's a disconnect. And that's a bad experience for the modern buyer. And for the seller, well, let's just say that the seller doesn't have much selling success if he or she isn't engaging with the modern buyer the way that he or she wants to engage. So that's what Glenn and I discuss on this episode. Now, this episode is sponsored by Lithium Technologies. In case you missed it, episodes 175 through 179 were co-hosted by Dale Hall, Senior Vice President of Marketing at Lithium. Now, the theme of these episodes is the 5 most influential topics in B2B marketing. We've made all 5 episodes available in one recording, so you can binge listen to each one, sort of like a training experience, or just one long podcast, about an hour, give or take, all 5 together. Now, you can also get the written version of this podcast series that we published in Social Business Journal Volume 10, and it also includes some bonus content. So to get both the podcast series, the 5 podcast series, and Social Business Journal Volume 10, just go to socialbusinessengine.com, click on the Up Close Podcast button that says Brought to you by Lithium Technologies. All right, now, here's my conversation with Glenn Donovan, Director of Clients at GaggleAMP. Glenn, welcome to the Social Business Engine podcast.
Thanks, Bernie. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Well, this is a conversation long time coming on the podcast. You and I have had many conversations offline for a variety of reasons. Why don't we begin with introducing both you and your company, GaggleAMP, to my listener?
Well, first of all, I have to say I'm a fan and subscriber to the podcast, so I'm really glad to be here today, Bernie. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I'm the Director of Clients for GaggleAMP, and what we do is help get your employees active on social media in a way that's coherent with your marketing strategy, but also supports their need to project themselves into the digital environment we live in today. My role there is, as I said, Director of Clients, and I look after our sales and customer success activities and really think about how we treat our clients from the moment of first contact through realization of value and the entire life cycle of it.
All right. Love the fact that it's the entire life cycle. Cool. So we are here to talk about this topic that is a favorite topic of mine. We talk about it a lot at Vengreso, and that is that the modern buyer, specifically the modern B2B buyer, needs a modern seller. So, Glenn, let's begin with what is it that we mean collectively? What do we mean by the modern buyer needs a modern seller?
Well, it's a great topic that we've talked a lot about, but I think there's a couple of angles we've yet to explore that I wanted to get into today about that. So I'd like to start thinking about the modern buyer first, if we could. There's some general trends that they're experiencing, right? The digital world is as overwhelming for them as it is for us, and I think sometimes we forget that, right? They are dealing with just a tremendous amount of change and new vendors and new technology and new possibilities they're really, have come to be because of the cloud and because of the SaaS model and a lot of other aspects of how we deliver technology and how technology is consumed and what we're able to do with technology. And so I think the modern buyer is really in a place where there's a lot of fear of missing out that's driving them. I think they're in a place where there's a plethora of tools and a lot of complexity that they're finding in almost any area. And of course, we're talking B2B here, right? And so
Right.
the modern buyer finds themselves in a situation where there's so much information and so many choices, it can almost be overwhelming. Obviously, that's not all that's going on, right? But it's one of the things I focus in on when I think about how to deal with our clients at GaggleAMP and how to deal with potential clients in general, is that they're confronted with how can they be effectively, acquire technology, work with all these possibilities that technology vendors present them, and be effective and get their job. And they're as challenged by doing that as we are selling to them in the digital environment.
So what I hear you saying, and I agree, Glenn, is that the modern buyer is really under a lot of stress because they are dealing with a tsunami of information and data and probably a lot of pressure that's coming at them from different constituents that they have to support within their organization. And in supporting those people, they're on meetings, they're on conference calls, that sort of thing, but yet they also have to conduct research and evaluation, and again, there's so much content available to them that it can be overwhelming.
It is. And of course, this, who you're selling to matters a lot, right? So we sell into marketing. We sell to marketers in across almost all industries in B2B settings, from small business all the way up to enterprise. So marketers are particularly subject to this because of the flood of the 5,000 or 6,000 SaaS vendors that have come along in the past 6 or 7 years. But we see this in CRM. You see this actually even in ERP. You actually see so much technology exploding in every segment, right? E-commerce, et cetera. It just goes on and on and on. And then if you look on the actual technology side, developer tools, platforms, all of the sort of building blocks of what we end up consuming, there's just as much complexity there as well. So I think you can safely say that overwhelm is a feeling that every buyer gets today at some point in their journey towards a buying decision.
So I think the other thing that we should touch on, Glenn, is the fact that, we're not talking about the modern buyer in singularity as one person, right? According to Gartner CEB, the modern buyer is 6.8 people in a committee, not just one individual. So how does that factor into us understanding the modern buyer?
Yeah, so buying committees have always existed in B2B settings. There was always different stakeholders who owned the buying process. But what you find today is that decisions are made in different ways. It looks more like consensus, but really you have, I think, the informal decision-making power inside organizations is much stronger than it once was. I remember when I first started selling, in really the mid 80s, technology to medium and then large size companies, there was a bit more of a command and control structure. Leaders drove more decisions. There was a little more formality to how a lot of things were done in large companies and small, from what I observed. And so what you see today is there's often informal buying committees that form within the organizational structure that really often are not aligned with the formal org chart. So I think you've got to be much more open-minded about who the stakeholders may be in a deal today, and think less about top-down command and control structures about how management works, and understand that management is really empowering line managers and at director levels to make a lot more decisions than probably I should see them driving 20 years ago.
Glenn, I think it's a great point. And as you point out, we've been at this for a few decades, so we've seen that phenomenon, that shift, right, from the command and control to the buying committee being kind of spread across the org chart. So I think it's a good segue for us to now start talking about the modern seller. So if the modern buyer is a committee and all across the org chart and, overwhelmed with data and input and constituents they have to serve, then how does the modern seller engage with that modern buyer?
So I'll tell you how we do it at GaggleAMP and the way I like to think about this. I want to engage them where they are and how they want to be engaged. And then I want to engage them with a lot of empathy and understanding for where they're at in the buying process. and I need to figure that out, how to do that in supported by digital channels as well as by live channels. Right. So the modern seller has to really understand that decision making has changed, and that the modern buyer has a lot of information at their fingertips. So they often believe that they're well informed, actually, and that you start from a point that where the buyer is perhaps not as open to being informed by the salesperson. Right. So I see all these things kind of coming together, whereas you as a rep, I approach more as helping them buy, or being in a teach mode or a learn mode versus the seller mode. I don't like to use the term help necessarily, but because I think you're still trying to get a transaction done and win a deal. And I think there's dynamics about that you have to keep in mind. But in general, I think that when you start with a mindset of understanding how your buyer expects to be engaged with on digital is a crucial way to start moving forward. And I think there's segmentation in that. We have some clients, prospect segments where they're really happy to be engaged over LinkedIn by us, right? And so we adopt that platform because those buyers, that group, those people like that, or are comfortable with that. That's preferred. Other folks, they still won't turn their cameras on. They dial into our meetings. They respond to phone calls, right? So we have to kind of know how people want to be treated, and then be really thoughtful about how we exploit the channels. But the feeling always has to be this one of empathy and understanding. And I think this really gets back to the overwhelm, right? I just see this going on all the time, and really helping the client think through the issues, but through being in teach and learn mode. So I think these all come together, right? If you can think about this another way, you really want to be oriented on helping the buyer buy these days, is the way I sum all of that up. Instead of thinking sell and your sales process so much, thinking more was like, what would help this individual I'm speaking with right now, or that I'm engaging with right now, move ahead? And then it starts, well, okay, maybe I'll record a video for them. Right? Maybe I'll create a custom piece of content that's going to help them go sell this. They're going to go meet with their boss. They had this great meeting with the GaggleAMP folks, and guess what? Here's the 6 things I think they're great at, and 2 customers that like. How am I thinking about helping that person get through the next step of the process, versus seeing it as like almost? I think a lot of salespeople can almost get into an adversarial mode without realizing it. Right? So I think the digital world is only a component of what's really going on with the modern buyer. So the digital world is only a component of what the modern seller needs to think about. I'm as focused on psychology and the sociology, frankly, of organizations, and the psychology of the individuals in the organizations, as I am on the digital world. I think you've got to think, about what's really going on with them totally, not just digitally, and then realize that digital gives a tremendous opportunity for you to express yourself and connect in interesting ways. But it comes from a place of understanding and empathy with the client first.
So I think where I want to go next in this conversation, Glenn, which is, really fascinating. You're touching on some really key points, and you've already begun to kind of address this, but I want to spell it out as we just unpack it a little bit more. And that's the difference between digital selling and social selling. And specifically, what I'm referring to is that a lot of people, a lot of companies, a lot of websites and blogs and podcasts and so forth have been talking about social selling now for several years. And so we have seen, and at Vengreso, we evangelize the phrase digital selling ourselves. You've been kind of touching on that. So let's unpack that a little bit more. What is the difference between digital selling and what has been known as social selling?
Well, I think to some degree these are semantics, right? I think a lot of us mean the same things when we use these terms, but it actually turns out that language matters, right? And it kind of frames how we'll think about these issues and how we solve the problems and challenges that are in front of us, right? So it's social selling is like saying my whole strategy is email selling, or phone selling or something. We're selling, and the digital presents us with social presents us with a channel, only one of many in the digital world. So to properly conceive of how you want to engage with clients as a rep today, you need to think about all these channels that are available to you, and the social channels are not all the digital channels you have available to you. We think about things like video. We think about things like text. We think about things like custom content. right? And then where else can we engage them? Are there communities that they participate in, right? Where are they engaging digitally? And by the way, they might not want to be engaging with us digitally. They may be engaging with other people digitally there, the influencers that they listen to. So there's another topic here, right? So in digital, I get to kind of look a little broader and think about who do I want to influence digitally, and kind of manage that in a new way as a rep, right? So I want to influence the client, and
I want to give a very quick example that you just jogged my memory on. Someone who I wanted to set up a meeting with. In fact, she agreed to having a conversation, not a meeting, a physical meeting, but a conversation. But she's she's a high ranking executive. I know she's very busy. And my fear was, when she said, reach out to me, my fear was that she wouldn't respond to my email. So sure enough, a week goes by. She doesn't respond to my email, Glenn. So what do? On LinkedIn, I message her and I say, I know you're busy. Maybe you didn't see my email. Here's a link to my calendar. At your convenience, schedule a call. And that's where she responded. So there's a digital touch point, right, that combined both email, where she didn't respond, and then a message on LinkedIn.
Right. And so understanding that people have different preferences, and that these preferences are evolving too. I've noticed actually a lot more uptake by senior people, director and above, actually, on LinkedIn over the past year. Much more engaging, much more open to engagement. A bit of a surprise to me. So you kind of have to keep an eye on it. But digital even presents a bigger challenge than this. We're talking about sort of the micro level of just your interactions as a salesperson. I think you really have to kind of map your territory out from a digital perspective, if you will. In other words, when I think about my target account list now, I want to also know about their digital, where do these people exist digitally, right? And the degree to which I can understand that is going to help me tremendously, right? And I actually think it's a weakness of a lot of the technology that salespeople have to use today, really understanding how to where to digitally interact with people. We can do a better job on that. But the rep has to really start to have a strategy around this, where before, one of the great things about being a rep 20 years ago is I knew, like, if I had a prospect, right, my pipeline was getting low and I needed some new prospects, I knew if I spent two 5-hour sessions dialing, I could end up getting 3 or 4 new meetings, moving something forward, developing some new opportunities, right? Like, I kind of knew how much effort to put in and what I could get out of it. So I think today there's more complexity for prospecting, so it can overwhelm the rep. So I think the rep needs to slow down and say, where am I really going to spend my time? What's going on with my clients? How should I be adapting to that? And really being thoughtful about, okay, maybe I should be using more LinkedIn messaging, or maybe this person is really busy on Twitter, and that's a much better way to engage them. I have luck on Twitter as well, right? So it's kind of more complex for the rep, but it pays off to think about it. So I think you have to step back and say, what's really my digital channel strategy with this prospect and my prospects and clients in general?
Okay. So you mentioned LinkedIn. I touched on it as well. So let's go there and let's talk about the difference between, traditional LinkedIn. I'm using air quotes, right? Nobody can see me because this is audio only, but traditional LinkedIn, where it was very profile centric, versus what you and I are characterizing here as digital selling. And how to use LinkedIn in a different way beyond just that traditional just profile. So let's unpack that a little bit, Glenn.
Yeah, no, and it's actually great that we're focusing on LinkedIn, because it's a perfect example of the complexity it imposes on the rep in terms of how they think about using it, right? So the phone or email never posed this kind of challenge to the rep in terms of thinking about what's possible, right? And one of the pitfalls you can fall in is to start to think you're a marketer, building your brand on LinkedIn. And while that is a good thing to do in some ways, my view has changed, and I built a pretty decent brand on Twitter and LinkedIn, but I wasn't getting great results. I had a lot of followers, but I didn't have a lot of engagement. And what was really shifted for me this year is using the platforms like primarily for engagement. And by the way, my brand is growing nicely as I do that. My followership is growing very nicely, and I have a top 1% SSI as a result. But really thinking about how to connect with people and communicate with them and nurture relationships by seeing what the people I'm connected to who I'm working with are posting and commenting on, by doing some more sophisticated things with my team. We call them double and triple taps, right? Where the rep will do an outreach to a line person at a target, and I'll do a LinkedIn out that maybe do that over email. I'll go over LinkedIn to a director or a VP and say, hey, my team is looking to establish a conversation with your marketing folks. I figure we should be connected. Something very casual like that, but letting them know there's some selling going on. By the way, I never hide the fact that there's selling going on. I'm never one of these salespeople who apologizes for being focused on doing business, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I find that these kind of simple taps get you in a different place with the client, where now, once they've accepted my invite, later mid-sales cycle, I can say, hey, things seem to have slowed down here. Has something happened? Should we be adjusting our course? I can get, now I've got the connection. So now I'm on their radar screen. They're seeing my content coming, my credibility is going up. So I reach out for that touch. So let me take it back to the strategy for the rep now. So that's much more complex than we could do on, even on email, really, right? Because of the way the connections are managed on LinkedIn and the content. So strategies have to be thought out more carefully. And I'm focused on engagement now and like conversations that are happening now, not so much on how great my brand looks on LinkedIn, if you will. But the good news is GaggleAMP provides a feed for me that gives me an amazing thought leadership set of thought leadership content for employee advocacy and social. So that's part of what I share that helps me there, and it helps build my brand, if you will. But in terms of where I put my brain these days, it's not on the next cool piece of content to share, because GaggleAMP does that for me for the most part. It's on how do I engage with folks creatively to help my team be successful, both on retention and renewal and on new deals. And we have plays that we run using LinkedIn as well for renewals when somebody's dropped out of contact with us. Right. So I don't know where we should go from here with that. I can explore a couple different of those areas if you'd like.
Well, yeah, where I actually want to go next, which you've already kind of begun to touch on a little bit, is the whole concept of account-based selling, account-based marketing, and how the lines are blurring between account-based marketing and account-based selling. And of course, that can be an entire podcast in and of itself. So
Sure.
Since, we're down to the last few minutes here on this episode, why don't you just touch on, you already kind of gave one example, but maybe expand on it a little bit from an account-based selling standpoint. What are you seeing that's working?
So from an account-based selling standpoint, we're doing something called multi-threading. Right, we're looking at how, as a team, we can face off with the prospect or client organization and be more effective at establishing and maintaining a value conversation. Is how we think about it. Right, that's how we think about the selling process in a way. Right, is looking at them as value conversations, and it turns out you need to keep the value conversation going after the sale. So it's not really that different. So what I mean by multi-threading is it could be our CEO, myself, customer success rep, and a sales rep, all connecting with different levels and different people who could be potentially or already known to be part of the buying committee on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever else we can find them. Even on some of our clients are really busy on Instagram, right? One of our clients is a really big figure skater as a hobby, and we engage her there, But having the team engage on digital and social in ways that are interesting is something that's working tremendously for us in building relationships.
Okay, cool. What about things that we shouldn't do? What are mistakes that you see being made out there, things that from a digital selling standpoint, people should not be doing?
Well, I was making some of them myself for a while, so I'll try to be self-critical versus criticizing everybody else in the universe here. Okay,
that's very humble of you, Glenn.
and it's not usually my strong suit, but we're working on it. I think that the mistake I used to make was being too formal, thinking of this as sort of prospecting versus engaging, thinking of it much more linearly, as trying to fill a pipeline. And now what I do is I think of building relationships as the primary objective of what I'm doing. And that's really what changed. So my comments are not designed to draw attraction to my brand or to set up what might feel like a trap for the person on their end. They're legitimate comments. When I get into a conversation on LinkedIn, I have no agenda. I'm sharing freely. I'm targeting the people I want to build relationships. That's it with my agenda, and they know that. But then I'm into delivering value and engaging and being somebody that they think is valuable to have in their network, and just really thinking about how much value am I contributing in those engagements. And that's the strategy that works versus trying to be too cute, too clever, too strategic, that just didn't work well for me. This is working fantastically in terms of just the number of engagements I'm having with clients and prospects, supporting my team online over LinkedIn and other social media.
Okay. And Glenn, the last question that I want to pose to you before I segue to my summary is, so how do we know we're succeeding? How do we measure results in the world of digital selling?
It's a great question and not an easy one to answer, because one of the primary problems with digital is that you're often encountering people who aren't even in a buyer journey yet for your product. There may be an interest in awareness of anything, maybe slight interest. So as reps, we've got to understand that they're not in a buying process and they can't go on our forecast, right? So we've got to understand that we're developing relationships that may take some time to yield even a real meeting or an opportunity, but that there's value in and of the relationship. Now, you've got to get hard-headed on the other end and make sure you're growing those contacts and you're measuring the number of people you're building relationships with in the target account. So your targeting has to be right. I want to see the targeting done smartly. I want to see the engagements growing. And then I'm always measuring that against sales activity in a funnel. None of that leaves you off the hook for, having enough demos, having enough proposals, having enough intro meetings, and having, enough pipeline to cover it up. So if you're doing this well, you will get more pipeline. But you're not going to, one way of thinking about it is you're working the very top of the funnel, right? Like your marketing team is typically these days. So you can't have an expectation that a relationship I build today is going to yield an opportunity next quarter. It may yield an opportunity in 4 quarters. And we have to, as management and individual contributors, get over it and understand that's the world today. And the more we think like that,
that's the world today. Okay, that might make its way into a tweet. All right, fantastic. So Glenn, this is where the part of the podcast where I attempt to summarize what we discussed. I try to kind of hit the treetops, and then I ask you to either fill in any holes, or if I jog your memory on a point that you didn't make that you want to make, I'll just ask you to keep it kind of brief, because we are nearing the end of this episode. I know that my listener has other things that he or she needs to move on to. So we began our conversation with a brief introduction to your role at GaggleAMP. You are Director of Clients, where you help employees get engaged on digital and really help them be successful throughout the entire life cycle of their customer relationship with GaggleAMP. And then we talked about the whole notion of the modern buyer needs a modern seller, and we began with a discussion of what is the modern buyer, and we agreed that he or she is someone who is very overwhelmed because there's a huge amount of change and vendors and technologies and complexities, and they have the fear of either missing out or not knowing, and there's just so many choices and so much information that's thrown at them, and that they need to be able to effectively make decisions, acquire technologies, and of course there's so many marketing technology choices out there that it's complex, it's difficult, so it is overwhelming to the buyer. But we also discussed that the buyer typically lives in a buying committee. And as we discussed, as you and I both know, buying committees have been around pretty much forever. The difference is that the way buying committees make decisions today is very different, because in years past it was very command and control centric, very aligned with the org chart. But these days it's more informal buying committees, and it's usually not necessarily aligned with the org chart, so it's just not as clear or black and white. So it makes it a little bit more complex from a selling standpoint. And that leads me to our discussion on the modern seller. We talked about how we need to engage the buyer where the buyer is. So because the decision methods have changed, we really have to have, and you made this point crystal clear, Glenn, empathy with where they are in the buying process. And we have to really look at using channels, digital channels, live channels that support the empathy that we need to deliver to the buyer wherever they are in the buying process. And one challenge is that the buyer is not as open to being informed by a salesperson, so therefore the modern seller needs to be in teach and learn mode, really have a mindset of helping the buyer. I know you're not a fan of the word help, so that's my word. So I'll ask you your indulgence on that. But helping the buyer to really just kind of move through the journey by being thoughtful of how to use the channels to really guide the buyer. Maybe that's another way to look at it, to rather than sell to them, to maybe provide custom content that just offers guidance and assistance and value. And you use that word a lot, and I totally agree. really adding value to the buyer's journey. You even mentioned that there's psychology in really engaging the buyer so that you are a resource to the buyer. We talked about the notion of, think digital selling and not social selling. We at Vengreso, in fact, we're not a fan of the word social selling, even though we know it exists and it's not like we are in denial. But we think in terms of digital selling, and, our conversation was around, hey, think about all the channels that are available: video, text, custom content, online communities, messaging. And, we didn't necessarily call this out, but messaging exists in LinkedIn, Facebook, even direct messaging on Twitter, again, text message. And, you make a really good point. You said map out your territory to understand where your audience exists digitally and then engage them there through value. And then we talked about kind of the difference between traditional selling on LinkedIn, which was very much around, a profile and maybe kind of hitting aggressively on people. However, really avoiding the pitfall of the salesperson thinking that they're just a marketer, but rather look for ways to connect and engage with people authentically and engage through value. Use the example of double and triple taps, where kind of a team selling environment where maybe your CEO, the VP, the director, and the salesperson are tapping different people within a buying committee, and you're really focusing on advancing the conversation. And I love your point about now conversations, really driving conversations now that are associated with an opportunity that you're exploring. We talked a little bit about account-based selling, which is, perhaps, very closely aligned to that double and triple tap approach, which again is a multi-threaded strategy where, again, you're focused on establishing and maintaining value conversations. And then we talked about things not to do. You said in your world, your example, you said, being too formal or too cutesy, it just didn't work. It's not about prospecting. It's about engaging. It's about building a pipeline by building relationships, but targeted relationships with target accounts, and always delivering value. And then we wrapped it up by discussing the whole, holy grail question of how do you measure results? Of course, you said it's not always a black and white thing. Build relevant relationships, recognize that it can take some time, grow your network within target accounts, measure engagement, measure activities that are sales related, sales conversations, and then of course measure pipeline and funnel, and then ultimately close business. And of course you close by saying, hey, that's the world we live in today, so we have to engage our buyer the way they want to be engaged today. Again, the modern buyer needs a modern seller. So Glenn, that's my summary. A little bit on the long side, I admit, but I'd love for you to just fill in any holes or elaborate on anything.
I just feel like I have to clarify my view on the word help. So here's at GaggleAMP, we've boiled our sales strategy down to very, very simple things: deliver value in every interaction and help customers buy. Right? So you're helping, but you're helping with a direction. Right? So salespeople aren't just helpers. We're helping those who we think might buy something buy from us. But we're doing that in a way that gives them what they need to make the decision. We don't look at it as a process that we're putting them through. If you step back, the larger point here is thinking about sales as a process can be really dangerous. Thinking about sales as helping somebody buy, I think, gives you a much clearer idea of what to do in the next instant. Right? Sales as a process may help you see it in a meeting back at the office, but when you're in the moment with a client on the phone, on an online meeting, in a demo, that's not the mentality that'll work, right? So that's helping them buy, being in teach and learn mode. All these are ultimately very respectful and all about delivering value, but they're also about us focusing your energies on where somebody's going to buy something. Like, so you're not just a helper, right? You're helping the company get revenue, okay? And you're doing it via helping, but there's a lot more you're doing besides helping. That's why when people boil this down to just helping, I think it's too simplistic.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good clarification point. You also said earlier, and I totally agree, there's never any need to apologize for wanting to have conversations around, wanting to do business together. As long as you're adding value, as long as you are delivering value, those are conversations that are always worth asking for and engaging in. So love that. Love that. Well, Glenn, you and I can have this conversation for hours at a time because we're both passionate about these principles. But of course, we do have to bring this episode to a wrap. So where would you like to send my listener online to connect with you and learn more about what you've got going on?
Great. So I can be reached on Twitter at Top Sales Coach. and then of course on LinkedIn. And I happen to have gotten there early enough, so you'll see the URL is just my name, which I'm kind of happy about. And of course, I'm at GaggleAMP. You can reach us at GaggleAMP, which is GaggleAMP.com anytime, and we'd love to help you get your team busier on social and more effective if that is ever something you want to talk about.
Fantastic. Well, my listener knows that all that will be linked up in the show notes. So, Glenn Donovan, thank you so much for joining me here today on the Social Business Engine podcast.
Thanks.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed my conversation with Glenn Donovan, Director of Clients at GaggleAMP. This has been episode 184, The Modern Buyer Needs a Modern Seller. I have to tell you, I really enjoyed this conversation with Glenn, just hitting on some key topics. As I said in the intro, if the modern seller is not engaging the modern buyer the way he or she wants to be engaged, there's a huge disconnect there. And Glenn and I, quite frankly, really kind of just scraped the tip of the iceberg on this topic. So I hope you got some good nuggets out of that scraping on this episode. Hey, speaking of this episode, it is sponsored by Lithium Technologies. As I said in the intro, episodes 175 through 179 were co-hosted by Dale Hall, Senior Vice President of Marketing at Lithium. Now, the theme of the episodes, those episodes, 175 through 179, is the 5 most influential topics in B2B marketing. We've made all 5 of those episodes available in one recording so that you can binge listen to each one, kind of like a training experience, or maybe a long train ride, or a short flight, or whatever the case may be. Now, you can also get the written version of the podcast series in Social Business Journal Volume 10, and that includes some bonus content. So to get both, just go to socialbusinessengine.com, click on the Up Close Podcast button. It says brought to you by Lithium Technologies. Now, before I wrap up this podcast episodes, I want to remind you that you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Of course, I'm looking for you to personalize that invitation. Tell me that you listen to the podcast. You can also catch me on Twitter and Instagram. I am at Bernie Borges pretty much everywhere. This podcast is active on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. On Twitter and Instagram, we are at SB Engine, and we use our full name, Social Business Engine, on Facebook. Now, look, if you are still listening to this podcast episode at this point, then maybe, just maybe, I'm thinking you enjoy this podcast, or at least this episode. So would you help me spread the word so that others can benefit from the insights that they can gain from guests like Glenn Donovan? So obviously you can tell your friends about it and share it on social media. And when you do, by the way, tag me at Bernie Borges so I see it. But you can also write a review on iTunes or Stitcher. We've made that easy. Just go to socialbusinessengine.com/iTunes, and you can just write the review right there. All right, well, that is a wrap for episode 184. I want to thank my guest once again, Glenn Donovan, Director of Clients at GaggleAMP. This is Bernie Borges, CMO of Vengreso, signing off and wishing you continued success on your social business journey.
Thank you for listening to the Social Business Engine podcast. Be sure to tune in again next week to reconnect with Bernie Borges for more insights, inspiration, and practical advice on social business. Visit socialbusinessengine.com to catch even more content on social strategy that will rock your business and your career.